what have I actually got to say in terms of, new work that have been carried out? The past year has really been about teaching from home and about all your books being in the university. We haven't done any field work, so what can I actually talk about in these strange times? So I suppose the retrospective bit is thinking about things which have been done in the past, some of the sort of the key themes around coastal archaeology, what we mean by coastal archaeology, and where that might take us. The prospect is one of the benefits that's come from being in this lockdown situation is talking to colleagues, frequently colleagues outside of Britain, who are doing similar things to myself. And this is something which, when you're actually teaching full-time or doing research full-time at the university, you don't really have the benefit, the extra time in order to keep up those kind of contacts. So this prospect is really looking at the kind of things which are being carried out in terms of maritime and coastal archaeology within the wider community, and thinking about how some of these ideas may apply to an area like Northwest Wales. So not so much about results of archaeological fieldwork, but thinking about where and how we might want to carry out new types of fieldwork. Now, to start off with, it's worth pointing out that what do we mean by maritime archaeology? What do we mean by coastal archaeology? And equally, what are the main themes? Well, on one level, particularly more recently, a whole series of excellent projects have been carried out by both Gwynedd Archaeological Trust and the Royal Commission under this Big Cherish programme that I'm sure many of you are certainly aware of, if not haven't been involved with. And the principal theme here is, on one level, it's to do with climate change, isn't it? To do with climate change and the effects of climate change on the coastline, and therefore the effects of climate change on archaeological sites along that coastline. So it's about management and looking forward and thinking how changes in climate, more stormy conditions, rises in sea level will affect the archaeological record. So it does have a research element to it, but the primary theme here is one to do with management. Now, alongside that is the recording of new sites. And I think here, following a model which was developed in Scotland, which again, many of you have probably been involved with, is a coastal monitoring project, which Gwynedd Archaeological Trust ran for quite a number of years, of getting volunteers to walk along stretches of coastline, usually the stretches of coastline that they would probably walk under normal circumstances, maybe taking your dog for a walk, and walking along those stretches of coastline and recording archaeological sites along that coastline, and particularly recording changes to them sites through time. This is, again, a very important strategy for managing, recording new sites within the sort of coastal, the coastline of Wales, in particular, in our respect, in this area of Northwest Wales. Now, in Europe, there is a terminology or an approach to coastal maritime archaeology that was really coined by Christian Westerdahl in published in the 1990s, but really came from work that he was carrying out in the 1980s in Norway, in Sweden, looking primarily at post-medieval sites and some Viking sites, and thinking about how we may want to do it in a different kind of way, how we might want to think about what we mean by the coastline, the differences between maritime archaeology and landscape archaeology. And I think that in Britain, there still is a bit of an issue around this. There's an issue around the types of methods and that are used in terms of landscape archaeology that we're perhaps all familiar with, and the methods which are associated with coastal archaeology, and also the methods that we associate with maritime archaeology. Different methods frequently different archaeological specialities, separate realms, separate publications in terms of different journals, the Journal of Maritime Archaeology, the Journal of Landscape Archaeology. So we tend to sort of compartmentalize the landscape and the maritime landscape. And this is something which, particularly in Scandinavia, Westerdahl brought together. And he brought it together in this idea of what he called the maritime cultural landscape. And what he means by this, we'll develop the ideas of what he means by this later on within the talk. But as an example would be the study of a fishing community. The maritime archaeology of that fishing community may be looking at the boats, for instance, whereas for Westerdahl, he would look at the boats, he would look at the boat sheds, he would look at the places where people dry nets, he would look at the houses that the people lived in, he would look at the beyond the coastline. He would draw that kind of maritime coastal archaeology beyond the coastline and look at the kind of social dimensions, looks at things like the composition of crews in boats, the types of transport networks that are used for the markets, for moving fish from the coast, from the harbours to market centres. So it's this idea of bringing the coastline inland, if you like, and looking at all of the things which were part of that community, part of the building up of that community, that maritime community, including things such as, like language, the names of places, the names of fishing, types of fishing equipment, the types of material culture associated with that fishing community. So this idea of a maritime cultural landscape is not just about recording things on the coastline. It's not just about recording things on the landscape, if you like. It's about bringing them together into this kind of united whole. So I suppose an example would be the archaeology of the quarries is largely stops at Porth Penrhyn, whereas for somebody like Westerdahl, he would say you need to study the quarries, you need to study extraction techniques in the quarries, but he'll equally need to study the transport networks going down to Porth Penrhyn and Porth the Norweg in Carnarvon. But equally, you need to look at the boats that are carrying the slate away, and the destinations and the buildings which are being used. It's broadening it out, it's creating these wider networks. So this idea of maritime cultural landscapes that, as I said, largely developed in Scandinavia. One really good study using this approach is this study of Strangford Loch. You can see this large, very beautiful volume on Strangford Loch, which is this big archaeological survey of the distinctive area, which draws on the approaches set out by Westerdahl in the 90s, and uses these types of approaches to look at Strangford Loch, the recording sites within the study area, but also the wider social and cultural implications of these maritime cultures, if you like. So it's in Bangor Library. If you want to look at this, it's probably the best study of using this kind of concept of maritime cultural landscapes. Now, we need to sort of think about some key themes. And one of the themes which we need to talk about is thinking about past coastal environment. Because if we're really going to talk about the archaeology, the maritime cultural landscapes, we need to know where the sea is. We need to know where the sea is, the relationship between the sea and the land. And if we don't, then we can run up all sorts of potential problems of thinking that a particular monument or a particular settlement is coastal when in the past it may not have been, or vice versa, a site which appears to be an inland site which may have had a maritime setting when it was originally occupied or used. So thinking about this idea of environment. Now, one of the key things about environment was really the key understandings of changes, of how sea levels change, and how, particularly how they relate to archaeology, is really founded on the work of William Borlace. William Borlace was probably the first person to note that archaeological sites were found underneath water, submerged within maritime environments, and yet when they were built, they clearly were not. They were clearly terrestrial sites. And he noticed this. Borlace was a Cornish antiquarian. He was also the canon of St Just, and then later into Penzance, down in West Cornwall. He quite clearly would have liked to have gone on the Grand Tour. He would have loved to have gone to Greece and Rome. He certainly corresponded with many of his contemporaries, like people like Stuckley, but he just couldn't afford it. He didn't have the resources to do this Grand Tour. So instead, he basically travelled around his parishes, and he travelled around West Cornwall, and he recorded everything that there was to see. He recorded archaeological sites, he recorded natural history, he recorded geology, he recorded folklore, stories. He basically created an amazing record of this area of West Cornwall. He also, on the bequest of the Bishop of Exeter, the Dean of Exeter, he was sent off to the Isles of Scilly to assess how much it was worth, basically. And he published this book called Observations on the Ancient and Prehistoric State of the Isles of Scilly, which is an amazing book, which is, it's amazing for a number of reasons. One, it's all written in first person because it's actually a very, very long letter to the Dean of Exeter. And the illustrations in this volume are absolutely unbelievable. It's unimaginable that he went there for about a week and he produced this book and he produced all these illustrations to go with it, where he records in minute detail all of the sites which he could see on the islands, building, castles, everything he could see on the Isles of Scilly in about 1856, I think, 1756, I think it was built. It was written. And one of his key observations he made, he recorded on the Isle of Samson, he recorded walls running off the hills and running into the sea. And he made the observation that this must have happened an awful long time ago, at a time when sea levels were much lower than they are at the present time. Now, of course, he's trying to interpret this within a biblical framework, but still that observation is a really important one. And this is an observation which didn't go without notice by O.G.S. Crawford, when after the First World War, he spent time in West Cornwall recuperating after the war. And he got a copy of Borlace's book, and he went off to the Isles of Scilly to look for these features recorded by Borlace. And there on Samson, he recorded and photographed these walls running from the island off into the sea. So the photograph on the right, you can see, I think this is probably Crawford and his +4s, standing by this wall. You can see going down into the below high tide. And on the photograph on the left, you can see these lines that you can see in the water are these photographs running into the sea, if you like. And this was published in the very first edition, first article in the very first edition of Antiquity, which is the journal launched by Crawford in 1927. Now, the other important, or certainly in terms of myself, but other people might argue that other things are equally important, was the publication of Clement Reid's Submerged Forests. Reid, I think, for a long time before, I mean, Borlace was quite clearly aware back in the 1750s of trees and forests being submerged by the sea. And this was in Borlace's mind, this was linked to the flood. But nothing had really been done in terms of recording them and thinking about where they were and recording the detail and trying to think about, why they were where they were. And this book by Reid really documents in a really comprehensive way the current state of knowledge in 1913 in the early 20th century of, where these forests were and how we might go about sort of thinking about interpreting them. So really important pieces of research in terms of thinking about the changing coastline. Now, in terms of what I want to talk to today is really to think about processes, because I think this is a good way of getting our heads around how the coastline may have changed and how this may affect about where we look for archaeological sites, and also how we interpret archaeological sites within the landscape and along the coastline. And there's three main processes that I want to talk about. I want to talk about sea level change or relative sea level change, about erosion along the coastline, and also deposition along the coastline. And these three processes are ancient processes. They've been going as long as time, and they're processes which, because of climate changes and rises in temperature, are processes which are accelerating. So they're actually really important processes to think about, not just in terms of interpreting the archaeological record, but in terms of the long-term sort of management of that record. Now, what we're looking at here is a global graph, if you like, showing sea level change, rises in sea level, just to explain what we're looking at here. I'll just put my specs on so I can see it myself. We're looking at the bottom is, this is 0, these are years, and we're going back in thousands of years. So this is 24,000 years, 10,000 years, 2,000 years. So the 0 is basically where we are now. So it's years before present along the bottom. And up the side, we've got meters. So we've got 0 being sea level, current sea level today. And then we've got going down in meters below. So we can see by reading up this chart, roughly 18,000 years ago, the global sea level was about minus 120 meters below what it currently is today. So what we're looking at here is a global change. So we're looking at the last ice age here, and this is the glacial maximum. This is the coldest that it gets, the absolute of the glacial stage. In Britain, we expect that to be about 18,000 years ago. And then what you're seeing is the slowly warming up of the atmosphere, warming up of the temperature, the climate, and with that, the ice, the polar ice, starts to melt. And you see this fairly rapid rise in sea level from around about, in this global stage, from about 22,000 years ago up until, about 7,000 years ago on this chart here. And what you see, these meltwater pulses, this is where the temperature is rising, and then you have a collapse of ice. And these pulses, these sort of extra ice falling into the sea, melting, create these surges in the sea level. So these surges, these sort of rises in sea level. So you can see a number of these as the temperature begins to rise. Now, this is a global chart, so it doesn't really help us too much for the British Isles. But I think the point that I want to make by looking at this is that you can see it's cold. As it starts warming up, you get this very rapid rise or relatively rapid rise in temperature, and then it sort of calms down a bit and it's just a slow, gradual rise. If you look at some ones for the British Isles, I'm sorry this has been taken from something which was originally in colour, but so you might not be able to work out which is North Wales and which is the Bristol Channel, for instance, but it doesn't really matter because all we're looking at is this kind of trend, and you can see this trend. So we're looking at 0 years. So this is 0, sorry, yep. So this is today, this is about 2000, this is us, 2000 AD. These are in calendar years BC. And you can see this rapid rise in sea level. And then at around about 5,000 years ago, roughly 5,500 years ago, you can see that it falls off and you get this kind of gradual slope. So this is the kind of pattern that you get from sea level. But this is only part of the story. So the picture that we've discussed so far is that it gets warmer. As it gets warmer, ice melts, water is released into the sea, and you get a rise in sea level. But as that ice melts, the land starts to rebound back. This thing called isostatic rebound. I always want to call this isotonic rebound, which I think is something that you get from drinking too much Lucozade. So the further north that you go, the thicker the ice. So you can see in this little chart here, you've got the ice overlying, pushing down into the mantle or the crust of the earth. As the ice is released, as the water melts, sea levels rise, but equally the ground rises up as well. And the further north, the further into the northern hemisphere you go, in our case, the more ice is released, the more the ground rises up. To explain this better, we've got this little chart over here, which is from Caroline Wickham-Jones's book. It's really handy. So you can see in this picture, we've got a little camp here. So let's say this is a Mesolithic settlement. We've got sea level. Interestingly here, you've got mean sea level, high tide and low tide. And if we imagine that sea level rises by 10 meters, it basically means that relative sea level is risen by 10 meters, and our site, if we're looking for our Mesolithic site, it's now going to be submerged underwater. If we head a bit further north, we see that the sea will rise by 10 meters, but the land rises by 5 meters, which means that we only have a relative sea level rise of 5 meters. Our site is still under the water, but it's not as deep. If we move into northern Scotland, northwest Scotland, Scottish Isles, or we move in over into Scandinavia, for instance, we'll see a scenario like this, where sea level rises by 10 meters, but the land rises by 20 meters, which means that we have a relative sea level fall of 10 meters, which means that our Mesolithic camp is actually now higher above sea level than it was when it was occupied. So it's really important to understand the difference between changes in sea level that we see in those graphs, the ones we looked at earlier, and relative sea level, because we need to take into account this idea of isostatic rebound. Now in Wales, we're sort of in this kind of C category. So sea levels are certainly higher today than they were in the past. And this probably affects certainly early sites like in the Mesolithic. So most Mesolithic sites that weren't on high ground will probably be flooded by water. But it is a bit of an uncertain process, because where you have like mountainous regions, you do tend to get more of this rebound taking place. So the question of the degree of this rebound in North Wales is still sort of slightly uncertain in some areas. Now, one effect that we've already touched on is the flooding, the rises in sea level, flooding lowland, and in particularly the presence of these submerged forests. So here we can see Gemma here walking across the, I think this is both, it is both. And this was from the storms from 2014, and showing, revealing, so blowing all of the, not so much blowing, washing off all of the sand and sediment from the top, and revealing these tree stumps in the ground, these submerged forests. And frequently these forests are, so these trees, you can, hopefully you could, technically you can radiocarbon date them, or you can do dendrochronology, you can work out when they died. You can look at their height above sea level, and you can use these in order to think about where sea level was and how this inundation happened, and when this inundation might have happened. But equally, they're associated with deposits. So here we can see these are these peat deposits. Peat deposits associated with tree stumps. This is from Triada Bay. And in the late 90s and into the 2000s, we have the Northwest Wales Intertidal Peat Survey carried out by GAT, who went out and recorded all of the documented sites where we have intertidal peat deposits. A fantastic resource. Some of these sites are just peat, some of these sites are also associated with tree stumps and other forms of vegetation. And one of the really great things about some of these about peat deposits like this is that these are terrestrial deposits. These are deposits which are formed when there wasn't this influence of the sea upon them. They can sometimes be associated with artifacts, sometimes artifacts embedded within the peat. It tells us maybe about some of the types of activities that are taking place. Sometimes you have footprints, sometimes human, sometimes animal footprints. Sometimes bones and such like from mammals are found within these deposits. Because they're organic, they can be radiocarbon dated, so we can have a context for those finds. And equally, we can find both macro and micro fossils associated with these deposits. So we can look for things like snail shells and insect remains, but also things like wood and twigs and seeds being preserved in these peat deposits. And of course, because it's peat, because it's these acid conditions, very good for preserving pollen. So they're a really important environmental indicator, which can tell us an awful lot about under what conditions these peat deposits were formed. One thing that does occur is that we get peat which forms in layers. So what I mean by this is that if we were to drill through with an auger through this peat deposit, there's a possibility we might find another peat deposit underneath. So we find peat, and then we find marine deposits, and then we find more peat. And sometimes this sequence can continue. And what this is demonstrating is these kind of transitions, these changes in the local environment taking place over a long period of time. And it's a really good indicator for how the landscape, how the coastline changes over a longer period of time. And this is something that I'll discuss with an example in a little while. Now, in terms of relative sea level, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here, is that relative sea level, you can see here, this is from Martin Bell's book on coastal communities in North Wales. I'm looking at relative sea level change. You can see this similar kind of pattern. We start off with sea levels really low. This is 11,000 BC, the beginning of the Holocene period, this period after the last ice age, where we've got sea levels, if you can see on this chart, this sort of contour of the map, which is right out here. This is the 30-meter contour, marine contour. But then as you go through time and you go into the Neolithic, we're looking at 5 meters below present, getting to the Bronze Age or the early Bronze Age, -2 meters. And as you go through time, I think this should say 1,000 B. No, maybe it's not, sorry. Not sure what's gone wrong there. We are basically see this gradual petering off through time. So starting off very deep, but then as we go through, you get more gradual rises in sea level occurring through. It's also worth, and that's something I touched on earlier, of when we're thinking about reconstructions and we're thinking about where the shoreline, where the the coastline was at any one period of time. So we're looking at the Neolithic coastline. It's not good enough to just say 5 meters from this kind of large model and then draw a line 5 meters and say this is where the coastline is. Because the most obvious thing that we need to also take into consideration is that 5 meters is mean sea level. Mean sea level actually doesn't exist. Mean sea level is what is considered to be ordnance datum. This is basically the point that ordnance survey maps are generated from. And it's a theoretical measurement taken actually from Newlyn in Cornwall. And it's basically, the average of where the sea is at any one time. If you could stand on the shoreline and you'd have to just guess when mean sea level occurs, it occurs within a cycle. And it's much better to think in terms of the actual cycle itself. So for Holyhead, so the general one for North Wales, you can see that we've got a 6.3 meter range. So mean sea level is at 3.17 meters above what's called chart datum. This is the lowest possible tide. And then we've got high tide, if you like, highest astronomical tide, 6.33. So when we draw a line, we really need to draw 3 lines. So going back to Caroline Wickham-Jones's drawing here, you've got low tide, mean tide, high tide. And sometimes this is something which is quite straightforward and simple, but we tend to forget that if you can't really draw a single line for where the coastline is, or certainly for where the sea is. Just let me show you this. This is Mike Roberts, Ocean Sciences, who I'm sure many of you will probably know. This is from his publication looking at the Menai Straits. And again, he's showing here what we've got on this chart. We've got calendar years BP at the top, so starting off from the present up until 16,000. And on this side, we've got height above sea level. So we've got 0 for the present. This is mean sea level. And then we've got the sea level curve. So you can see again how we've got from about 13,000 years ago, steep rise. When we get to about 5,500 years BC, so that's 7,000 BP, you can see it changes. So this is the Mesolithic, if you like, to this sort of gradual curve. And what he's looking at in this chart is basically the period where Anglesey becomes separated from the mainland, where you see this kind of breach between the island and the mainland. And he's estimating that this happens at around about this date here. I'm looking to see where it roughly is. So that's 1,000. I have to work this out. That's 900. So it's about 8,500, something like that, BP. And he's looking at the high and low tides, as you can see. So this is when it's breached, but it's not finally breached. He's arguing that not until about roughly about sorry, always have to about 3,000 BC, if you like, so into the sort of the late Neolithic, if you like. It's not until you get to then that you get this final breaching. So he's arguing that this is where the initial separation of it being a landmass happens, but that you can access Anglesey tidally up until around about 3,000 BC. So again, he's looking at sea level, the mean sea level, but also looking at the high and low tide in order to estimate when this was accessible at low tide. And I think this is really, it's interesting, but it's actually really important for thinking about how we think about something like Anglesey. And if we're thinking about Anglesey as an island, you have to think about, when did it become an island? What is different about Anglesey as an island as opposed to Anglesey as part of the mainland? Now, the second theme is one of coastal erosion, something that I'm sure everybody's very familiar with in terms of thinking about the effects of wave action, of rising sea levels on the coastline, and in particular, the erosion, the slow erosion or the fast erosion of archaeological sites. So here we can see Dinas Dinlley, one of the key sites which is being currently looked at by Gwynedd Archaeological Trust with Royal Commission, and various other partners under this Cherish project. And with erosion comes deposition, which we'll talk about in a moment. So sites being slowly eroded by wave action. And this creates something of a problem for the way that we record archaeological sites, because in terms of actually going out and doing field work, the sites look in a very different kind of way than we would normally expect, because we're frequently not seeing these sites in plan, we're frequently seeing them in section. These aren't from Wales, these are two sites, both from the Isles of Scilly. What we're looking at in these photographs is on the right-hand side, this is a site called Halingi Porth, excavated by, recorded and then excavated by Paul Ashby. And what you're looking at here is, if you look at the bottom diagram, this line here is showing the cliff face. So the cliff face. And then this curve is the curve of the hut circle that he's recording. And you can see that most of the hut circle, well over probably 3/4 of the hut circle, has been eroded away. It's disappeared. This is the entrance into the house, and this is the entrance into the house. So what you're looking at in this, if you can get your head around it, is you're looking at the entrance going out of the house, and this here is part of the wall curving around back into the section. So the back of the wall curving around into the section. So when we look at these sites, you've got to get your head around about looking at sections rather than looking at things in plan. On the left-hand side, we see something very similar. This is another hut circle. This is from a site called Porth Cressa. And this is the wall of a hut circle. The other side of the wall is over here. So if we look at this here, this is the wall in the drawing. This looks slightly different because we record the different times. This stone here is the other side of the wall. And this is the other side of the wall, which I assume is over here. And what we're looking at here is the opposite of this. We're looking at just a little bit of the wall that's been clipped away. So this, so a small part of this house, which has been removed by the sea. So the remains of this wall are inside. So this wall is curving outwards in that direction. This one's curving round in that direction. So the majority of this house is still under all this sand and deposit, which is overlies there. You can see there's features. There's actually a midden inside this house. There's a whole series of sort of cut features that can be identified within the house. So part of recording sites that are eroding, one point is that through erosion of this type, you discover sites which you probably wouldn't discover under normal circumstances. Both of these sites have this sand and then turn into agricultural land on the top of them, overlying them. So probably would never be discovered. So through erosion, we're actually identifying archaeological sites. The problem is they need to be recorded very quickly, or relatively quickly, because they will start to fall away and into the sea and be lost. But also, there's a problem of excavating. How do you excavate something in section? Do you have, especially if you have several meters of sand or deposits overlying them? So there's a whole series of challenges, both in how you record these sites and how you then go about investigating them further. I think Dinas Dinlley being a classic example, recording quite a small section of archaeological material on the top. And it involves people having to, abseil down cliff faces in order to draw this section. So there are really serious problems about how you interpret, how you identify, and how you record sites caused by coastal erosion in this nature. Now, the third area, we've done two, yeah, this is number 3, is coastal deposition. And I think this is something which we tend to not think about so much, or we don't really think about it as important. But if you think about it, when you have erosion, you're basically releasing deposits, releasing sediment. That sediment has to go somewhere. So one of the effects of coastal erosion is coastal deposition. And I'm sure I read somewhere that Britain is actually getting bigger rather than smaller. And this is largely to do, the more erosion of the coastline means that things are deposited elsewhere, and the coastline sort of gets bigger rather than smaller. That's, I'm not saying it's sort of against any kind of obvious logic. And in some instances, for instance, along the southwest coast of Anglesey, we see massive deposition, both in terms of, most notably in terms of Newborough Warren, but also places like Aberfraw, which we'll talk about in a moment, transforming the landscape. And Rothgaia being a classic example, project or a GAT of undertaken over a number of years. The identification of, in this instance, early medieval structures, so really nationally important archaeology here, overlain by wind-blown sand deposits, which have quite clearly been blown there, been transported there from elsewhere off to the sort of southwest somewhere. So in some instances like here, we can say that sand inundation in terms of this part of Anglesey has to have been after the early medieval period. So something happened around about then, which storm event, some kind of tsunami event perhaps, which released sediment. Sediment was washed up by the sea and then blown up by wind and deposited over sites like Rothgaia. Now, in terms of thinking about sedimentation, we have to remember longshore drift, if you remember from your O-level or GCS geography. And in the southwest, this happens following the prevailing winds from the southwest. So basically, the main wave regimes and weather regimes coming from the southwest and eroding from the Pembrokeshire, for instance, and material being washed up along Cardigan Bay, washed along the Clean towards Anglesey, washed up into the Irish Sea. Over on the left here, you can see these are of sediment zones, and you can see these units, sediment units. And the unit that we're really interested in here is possibly number 9, which is from the tip of Pembrokeshire to the tip of the Llŷn Peninsula. And you can really see why this is the case. You can imagine weather coming in this direction, it's eroding all the way along Cardigan Bay, and all of that sediment is going to be deposited along the Llŷn Peninsula. From tip of the Llŷn Peninsula to the Leven Sands, if you like. I guess that's where it is, or maybe it's further over. Maybe actually I think it's up to the Great Orme. You can see here similarly erosion taking part along the coastline. Material, maybe even material washed in from the Irish Sea, is going to be deposited along here. So it's going to get deposited along southwest coast of Anglesey and potentially within the Menai Straits, forming things like the Leven Sands and such like. And of course, in estuaries, we get sand spits forming, these gradual spits which form across these estuaries because of longshore drift, blowing material along. And within these estuaries, you get salt marsh forming behind the spits themselves. So we can see this kind of process happening. I think a really good example of this would be looking at Daston estuary, where you've got deposition, you've got sediments being washed along the coastline and forming these wedges like Morfa Harlech, for instance, which slowly moving across, getting bigger and bigger. You can see this process like in the chart of the sediment forming these active sand dunes on one side and then stabilized dunes, and then land, which was formerly sea, being reclaimed on the other side. And enclosing things such as the former island of Innis, which is here, becoming surrounded by land. And originally, before these dunes were formed, would have been an island in its own right. You can see it better in this photograph here. You can see this is Morfa Harlech, and this is the island of Innis. And you get this process forming, you get a bar forming, you get lagoons forming behind the bars, you get salt marsh conditions forming. You slowly get almost like terrestrial conditions forming behind these bars. You may even get trees growing behind these bars. And then you get a big storm event, destroys the bar, and you start back to square one again, and you get the deposition forming. So when we think about these sand wedges and we think about these terrestrial conditions forming, we have to remember it's not a single one-way process. It's a much more dynamic process than that. We see these changes, which is why we get peat forming, terrestrial deposits forming, and then we get layers of marine deposits over the top of them, and then we get terrestrial deposits forming, marine deposits forming. These kind of sequence of events is because of these dynamic processes which happen, particularly in these kind of estuarine environments. In some cases, some more dramatic cases, we get examples in the Glassland estuary where we get, Maddox's cob, which basically reclaims a whole swathe of land in the estuary, and we get these terrestrial conditions forming behind the estuary. But we know that if we drill a hole into the ground here, we only need to go a few meters into the ground before we get to saline conditions. Thinking about sites, this is basically looking at some of the sites which over the years we've been looking at this area within the Glassland estuary, and looking at these midden sites. These are sites with preserved midden deposits, which can tell you about, well, obviously one thing is that, the marine deposits can be, in terms of shells, I should say in this respect, can be dated through radiocarbon dating. They are found, they can tell you about the types of resources people are using in terms of, what people are eating, if you like. They can also tell you about the types of environments that people are living in. If you have species of shellfish, for instance, which are associated with exposed coastlines, then tells you something about the types of environments that people are going to, certainly, in order to collect these shells. And one would assume they're probably not going that far. So we've got, this is Garrick Histrum, this rock shelter, a Mesolithic rock shelter dating from about 7,000 BC, so an early Mesolithic site. And then we've got a number of other sites in the area. And it's in this map. It's actually quite an interesting map. It's basically just been coloured according to gradient, but because the resolution is every 5 meters, that most of this land, which, as you know, you can drive along here and you can walk across here, is only about 1 meter above sea level. So most of this land is only 1-2 meters above sea level. So it's basically made it all white. So I haven't intentionally tried to reconstruct what it would look like, but I think this gives quite a good indication of what it would look like in terms of, you've got a whole series of islands. So this is the island of Innis, for instance, which is the one that's tucked into the Morfa Harlech. And then you can see this is by Porthmadog. You can see this almost like little sort of peninsular island sticking out. And the peninsula coming out here. Penrith Drydreth is here. This is this site called Here Innis, and other sort of sites. This is Innis 4, this former island in the middle of the estuary. Also got a whole series of hill forts, which interestingly, around the estuary, and certainly the site at Innis 4, and potentially the site at Here Innis, but certainly Innis 4 is quite a substantial site. And potentially a site on an island in the middle of, what may have looked more like a Scottish loch than a salt marsh. It's interesting thinking about, what that means. In terms of defensive sites, this is a much more potentially defensive site than many of the other ones. And why are they? What are they doing? Why are they controlling this area? Is there something important about this place? We'll come back to that in a second. Another site which is not on that map, which I'll just show you where it is. It's just beside Gareth Histrum. It's just over here, called Park Coed, excavated by Clive Hudson, who couldn't make it tonight. Just to tell you that the midden deposit which was excavated there, this picture is not actually of the midden site. This is at the site. This is of Coed, Park Coed. I couldn't find a picture of the actual the midden that was excavated by Clive. These are these weird kind of circular structures that we never really got our heads around what they were. we only deturf them, but they're only represented by big flat slabs of stone that are placed in circles on the ground. This one's terraced into the hillside. They don't seem to be of any great date. They may be associated with some kind of industrial process, perhaps. It's quite flummoxing. We thought maybe there was some kind of like like I would say squatter camp. That's not really what I mean, but associated with the construction of the Croeso tram line. There's all sorts of interpretations about what they might be, but we haven't really figured out what they actually are. But anyway, the midden is just higher up on the same site. But it's just really to highlight that Clive's article, his excavation report on this site, is coming out in the Archaeology of Wales, which is due out any time now, those of you who subscribe to that. And it dates this site, the midden site is as an Iron Age site, a sort of a middle to late Iron Age site. Other things which I just want to point out before we move on to other things is that when we think of this Glassland estuary and we think of these estuaries, it's worth pointing out this really unusual feature, and this is a feature called Son Badrec. And this is what it looks like at low tide. Son Badrec is this moraine. It's a moraine structure associated with a glacier which is coming off Snowdonia out into the Irish Sea, and is carving this very deep channel out into Tremadog Bay. Actually, the Glassland estuary is very deep as well, carving out into Tremadog Bay. And this is so deep that this would be fairly unaffected by changes in sea level. So the idea is that this is one side of the glacier where you've got these moraine deposits and you've got shallow water on this side and deep water on this side. So when we sort of think about reconstructing where coastlines would be, the coastline, even if sea level was 20 meters deeper than it is today, so out here somewhere, you'd still have this deep channel leading into these estuaries. And this is what it looks like in reality on the ground today, and continues out for a considerable distance out into into Tremadog Bay, almost the length of the whole of the Llŷn Peninsula. Quite a formidable site actually in its own right. You get to really low tide. Looks pretty spectacular, and you can see why people thinking it's like Son Badrec, this kind of trackway leading out over to Ireland, because it just seems to go on for miles and miles and miles. It's a really interesting geological feature, which probably does have some archaeological significance in what people must have thought about this. It's interesting, just saying this out of the curiosity, interesting that you do have this group of Neolithic monuments, around Llanfair, for instance, in this area here, just to the south of where Son Badrec is. Okay, thinking about other areas along the coastline where we've got this inundation of deposits and how this changes our interpretation of this landscape. So one key area we've already talked about is Newborough and Newborough Warren. We've also, very importantly, Aberfraw, this clogging up of Aberfraw through these deposits. And then further up, like there is a valley. This whole area, if you like, of the southwest of Anglesey is really affected by deposition. Now, when this deposition happens is not really that clear. Obviously, we said with Ruthgaia, got an idea that some of this deposition certainly is happening into the early medieval period. There we go. This is looking at Aberfraw. So we can see this big wedge of sand, and we can see a lagoon forming at the back of it. And certainly at Aberfraw, work carried out by Bailey in the 1990s and published in 2001 suggests using a variety of different types of dating techniques, particularly in this instance, a thing called OSL dating, which actually dates the quartz and micas in the sand, suggests that this sand deposit is basically formed in the last millennia. So basically, it only dates to like the past 1,000 years, and is probably the result, rather than of a continuous process, is rather to do with a single or a number of different storm events. So some kind of, perhaps kind of tsunami events is probably the way to think about it. So a lot of sediment has been released from somewhere and then redeposited. Now, one candidate for this, not for the initial deposit, is the breaching of Son Badrick. The breaching of Son Badrick and the releasing of sand of deposits from the back of Son Badrick would certainly release deposits, which you would expect on the Clean Peninsula. Some of this may be washed out into sea, forming sandbanks in the Irish Sea. Some of this may be redeposited down there. But anyhow, regardless where this has come from, a large amount of deposit has been eroded from somewhere, presumably along Cardigan Bay, and redeposited at Aberthrau. And this basically changes the way that we think about sites. Because when we look at sites around here, we don't necessarily think of them as coastal. And this will the reason why I'm talking about this in terms of the relevance of how we might need to rethink about what we mean as coastal, hopefully will become clear when I start talking about some examples. And here's a good example. Thinking about sites that are coastal. Well, Trewendee is quite clearly coastal. You know, it's really very fantastic Bronze Age cairn, which overlies an earlier Mesolithic site, probably a Mesolithic camp of some description, quite an extensive Mesolithic site, a Mesolithic site which has been reused in the Bronze Age. This finding earlier sites underneath later sites is a recurring factor, not just of coastal sites, but of sites elsewhere, of places, certain places, of certain locales, to use the sort of trendy terminology, having sort of significance in later periods as reuse of particular places. And it does bears the question in terms of Trewendee, which is found on this headland here, that when Trewendee was in use, quite clearly it was marking the entrance into quite a sizable coastal inlet. Now, is this just an accident? Or does this have any significance at all? It's you know, it's a moot point. How do you demonstrate that that's significant? Maybe it's just a random thing. Maybe it just has to have a nice view of the mountains. Now, in thinking about this, I think it's worth starting to think back, thinking about the perspective that we have of the sea, and thinking about the way that we think about the sea, and thinking about the relationship between the sea and the land in a potentially different kind of way. And I want to start off with a fantastic piece of work that was done by Tim Robinson, really throughout the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, and mapping, starting off by mapping in his hometown on the Aran Isles, but also in Western Ireland. I'm not sure what he's doing in this photograph. You see, I don't know if he's thrown it out of all of these 35mm film, or whether his cine projector's broken down. It's a bit unclear what the photograph's about, but it is Tim Robinson. And in the area in the centre, you can see this is one of his maps. These beautifully hand-drawn maps, been published in more recent years. And what's really interesting about these for me is that if you know the Aran Islands, you know that this south coast of the Aran Islands are these enormous cliffs, these sort of 50, I don't really know how high they are, the 50-metre cliffs, these enormous big cliffs anyway, fairly impenetrable, this coastline. And yet, look at all these names. These names relate to the cliffs, they relate to particular features of the cliffs. It's almost like every single inlet, every single rock, every single rock face has a name associated with it. And these are old names. These are not names that he's given them. These are names which are passed down in an oral tradition. And really what's interesting is the disparity, if you like, or the contrast between the cliffs and the mainland. All right, there's names, some of the buildings have got names, but most of the land, for somebody who's recording place names, doesn't seem to be giving any real significance. And if you think about it, things really take on significance when they're given a name. When something's given a name, it has a story, it has some kind of human relationship with it. And the reason for this, in terms of this naming of this coastline, is because these sites have been named from the sea. They're associated with movement on the sea. The land has been named from the perspective, the maritime perspective. So these three places take on meaning by people being in boats, basically fishing around the islands. And they're used in order to locate places on the sea, and no doubt they have stories associated with them. In a similar vein, great idol of mine, let's say, Angus Martin from up in Kintyre, gave me this map. And this is a map similar to the one by Robinson. And this is a map, which is a secret map, family map. And it basically names all of the places along the coastline of the Mull of Kintyre. This is what the Mull looks like. And these names of these places, you'll never see them on an Oldman survey map. These are places which are known by particular fishing families and are passed down through generations of people. They're about knowing about how to locate yourself. They're about, in a sense, they're about ownership, about being able to locate places in the sea, about good places to go, how to react in certain conditions. So basically knowing how to get yourself home being an example of that. So they're about an apprenticeship at sea, if you like. And similarly, Henry McCall, who's probably the only maritime anthropologist, archaeologist who worked for 20 years as a skipper of a deep sea trawler off northern Canada, has done some amazing work in Scotland, where she's similarly looking at Scottish fishermen and looking at the way that they work ground, basically the areas that they go to fish and how they locate those places and how this is passed down through families and how the sea, just like the land, is socialized. It's socialized by people going out there and doing things on the sea, and that it is not open access. It is basically, you have places where you go and drop your lobster pots, you fish. If somebody else comes along, you get conflict because the sea is about as much about ownership as the land. And in particularly, I think this is quite interesting in terms of thinking about people's relationships to landing places, of access to going to particular places along the coastline, and who can go to certain places, who can land boats at particular places. Because we have this kind of idea maybe in the past that anybody can land anywhere, anybody can go anywhere. In terms of boats, probably in Northwest Wales, we're probably talking about skin boats. The problem being, of course, that they don't really survive within the archaeological record. So here we can see two types of boats. We've got this is an Inuit ymwneud, which is made of seal skin. You can see pulled over a wooden frame. And here we can see upside down an Irish curragh. So two types of boats, which probably existed in prehistory, but how would you recognize this within the archaeological record? Probably very difficult too, because it's fairly insubstantial, wouldn't survive in very easily, and because they're associated with exposed coastlines, in other words, for going in quite stormy conditions, the chances of them surviving along an exposed coast is extremely slim. If we were to think about how you go about making one of these, one of the things that you might associate with the making of these, and certainly the anthropology or the ethnography and ethnohistory from the Arctic would suggest that something like a burnt mound would just about do the trick. Something where you can heat stones up, you can create steam, you can bend wood, you can work with hides, would sort of fit the bill for the type of site that you might be able to identify. But So here we have a burnt mound, but a burnt mound not associated with boat. This is a site which was excavated in, I think, 2007, I think, roughly about, published in British Archaeology, 2009. It's a really significant site. This is down on the Llyn Peninsula, Mount Farm. And what's significant about it and why it made it into British Archaeology was that it was a site exposed in the coastline, being eroded away. It was a burnt mound that was known about. The burnt mound was being eroded away, but on excavation, it turned out to have this wooden trough, which was really well preserved. And you can see it's got this kind of runnel running into it, probably to transport water from the local stream into it, surrounded by lots of burnt stone, quite clearly a burnt mound. And one of the interpretations of it was that it was for brewing beer, which is why it made it into British Archaeology. On closer inspection of the site and the removal of the planks from the site, it was noticed that these square holes were found in the planks. It had obviously been reused from something else, some other purpose associated with it, and has this curved profile to it. Now, through close examination of this, it's quite clearly part of a boat. And the type of boat it's part of, it's very similar to boats excavated, for instance, this one at Ferriby. You can see it under excavation and here in the 1960s. And you can see this is what's called a sawn plank boat. And what it is that if you can imagine, if you've got a log boat, if you have a log boat, the size of the log boat is always going to be limited to how wide it is. So you can have a long, skinny boat, but you can't have a boat which has any width to it. And width equals stability. But if you use planks, you can join the planks together, the basis of sort of modern wooden boat building. You can use planks and you can join them together to create your boat. And the means by which these were constructed was by sewing them together. So basically having these holes, square holes, and withies made of yew, tying together the planks. These were all plugged with wax and sphagnum moss packed along into the joints to make actually remarkably seaworthy boats. Now, what's really significant about Mount Farm is that this list of boats on the right-hand side, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 boats. Not all full, we've got some really good boats from Ferriby. We've got obviously the Dover boat, which for some reason isn't on there, which is a bit worrying. I must have deleted the Dover boat. How could I possibly have done that? One of the key archaeological finds of the last 50 years. Never mind, Dover boat, which is down here, obviously, should be on here as well. It should fit in roughly about where Mount Farm is in terms of date. But the point is that these are all of the sawn plank boats known in the British Isles. Not just that, these are all of this type of boat known in Europe. There seemed to be a very British phenomena, and for a while they seemed to be associated with the Humber and later with areas in Dover. So they seem to be in key areas. This was probably largely to do with the two Wright brothers who are working in the Humber, looking for these sites. In this respect of the Humber, they're found in association with other things, with other features along. There's a capstan, which was found by one of the Wright brothers in association with these sites where these boats were found. But increasingly, they've been found in Wales, in the Severn Estuary, at Goldcliff and Caldecott. But now we have this boat from the Llyn Peninsula. All right, it may not be in its original setting. It's probably been washed in from somewhere else. It's only a plank from a boat, but it tells us that these boats, which are quite capable of crossing the Irish Sea or crossing across to Europe, are being found in Welsh waters. And not just in Welsh waters, exposed Welsh waters, in this instance in Cardigan Bay. Now, where it's come from, whether it's washed in from further down, probably from one of the estuaries in Cardigan Bay and has ended up over on the Llyn Peninsula, is quite possible. It may be that there's more of the boat still on the site, somewhere else. A bit of a needle in a haystack finding out, but it is really, really significant. And I think that it's significant not just on a local level, it's significant internationally because there's so few of these examples of these boats within the British Isles. Now, in relation to that, I just thought I would have this, this picture, which is a really awful picture, but it illustrates the point. And it's really thinking about what I was saying before. And this comes from an article by Kristen Ives, which comes back to talking about other people. Kristen, now, she's originally from Estonia and she's worked in the Baltic, but she now works in Finland. And she wrote this article called Do Ships Shape the Shoreline? She's not really talking about ships, she's talking about boats, but it doesn't really, the alliteration doesn't work with boats. So do ships shape the shoreline? And what she means by this is, does the presence of boats and people doing things on the sea, going out to sea, whether that's to do with trade and exchange networks, whether it's to do with people going out fishing or people coasting along, going from place to place, does this shape in some way the coastline in terms of the types of activities and for that matter, the type of sites that we might find? So what would landing places, the places where communities, different communities from different areas sort of meet each other and maybe trade with each other, this interaction between people take place? What would they look like in the archaeological record? And can we identify them? And she's got a very positive attitude towards this and has demonstrated that they do exist. And using a fairly obvious methodology, and this is a methodology that was put forward by Marika Maggi, basically thinking about looking at sites mainly in Scandinavia, largely associated with the Baltic, but thinking about what kind of criteria do these sites all have in common with each other? And she's looking primarily, thinking about what kind of criteria can be used for the identification of prehistoric landing places. And she comes up with these criteria that, one, they're probably going to be associated with prehistoric graves or grave fields. That's where she's basically talking about urn fields in this respect. Close to the coast. They're going to be found on shorelines that are protected from strong winds. So they're probably going to be associated with coastal inlets. They're going to be associated with estuaries primarily. They're not going to be on exposed coastlines. They're not going to be found in South Stack, for instance. And they are going to be situated in a cultural landscape. The other is a situation in the cultural landscape as seen on Northern survey maps in the 18th and 10th centuries. I think that must, which diverges from the normal, roads meeting at certain points. So basically what she's talking about here, she's basically talking about looking at old maps and old state maps, such like, and basically looking for places where you get old roads going to the coastline or roads meeting at a certain point on the coastline, which don't really make any modern sense. These could be hints at the potential places where old landing places and harbours and such must be. Because ultimately the technology for landing a small boat, whether it's a small wooden boat in the 18th or 19th century or a small wooden boat in prehistory, probably isn't that markedly different. She also goes on to highlight another whole series of criteria, looking at the presence of medieval manors, early medieval manors, but Nancy wishes we had a few of those, and also of Basilian harbours. This is basically the local sort of ancient peoples of Estonia. Also things like medieval churches. So basically she's asking, to say some attention is also paid to toponyms, basically place names, and also to folklore. And once you identify these places, she's then suggesting that you go through a standard methodology of fieldwork methodology, and she does metal detector survey, phosphate analysis, and magnetic survey to basically further highlight potential areas. So what she's doing through phosphate analysis and magnetic survey, for instance, susceptibility, is basically looking for areas of intense activity in association with these other criteria. And they're using this to identify potential sites. And over on the right, you can see some of these sites that Kristen Eves in particular has been identifying sites all over with these jetty sites, an association of these prehistoric landing sites. This site here is a site that was excavated, I think in 2010, which is a site which is on this coastal site, this kind of coastal inlet, associated with these jetties going out into the shallows and structures associated with them. And this dating from around about 4000 BC. And Kristen in particular sort of feels that maritime coastal archaeologists, or archaeologists generally, she's an early medievalist, must be said, are just far too pessimistic. And she's saying that, the problem is that the minute you decide that these things don't exist, the minute you decide that these things must have been destroyed, that sea levels have changed, or there's too much agriculture, the minute you think of excuses why these don't exist, you will not find them, even when they're staring you in the face. And this comes back to this notion of cultural maritime landscapes, and what we have to imagine what these sites might look like. Not just landing stages, but maybe you might have certain structures associated with the storage of boats coming out of the water. You might have settlements. You might have drying racks for drying fishing nets. So you might have the presence of hauled stones. You might, all of these things which are usually put down as loom weights may have a maritime function to them. So we have to start to imagine what these sites would look like. Now, an Anglesey, you can see on the left-hand side, this is from the Royal Commission volume on the sea, which came out last year. And these are looking at the first edition of the Oldman Survey Map and other sources to identify historic anchorages and historic landing places. Now, this would seem to be a really good starting point to thinking about whereabout would we start to target sites to look at. And one site that I think fits many of the criteria set down by Kristen would be Portharach. That you've got prehistoric settlement, you've got prehistoric monuments. Prehistoric monuments in this respect quite close to the sea level. How close they were to the contemporary sea level, I'm not sure. And you've got roads converging. You've got a number of criteria which fit the criteria set down by Eves. Other similar sites might be Aberthrau, the fact that you've got this large coastal inlet coming in. You've got other sites in that area. Other sites that spring to mind, I'm just thinking of sites off the top of my head by now, is that I think that the site in Newborough Forest, there's a site in Newborough Forest which is associated with very early beakers. I think that potentially would be a site really worth sort of revisiting in terms of that area around there and thinking what's going on. Is this a settlement site? What kind of activities are taking place there? So I think there's great potential for addressing some of these themes in North Wales. Other themes which are interesting would be the idea of trackways, something that was put forward by Bowen and Gresham. Trackways from the sea, frequently from some of the estuaries in Cardigan Bay, marked out by prehistoric monuments going inland, thinking about what happens at the sort of the seaside. It's in terms of these standing stones at Canver, for instance, be a really good case in point. What's the context of them? What's going on around them? How close to the sea actually are they? Is there any kind of other structures in association with them? Would be a really interesting potential area to identify. Because these estuaries are potentially important just in terms of metalwork coming into these areas. There are a number of quite prestigious metalwork found in the areas, presumably being traded from elsewhere and being brought in. So estuaries as places of interaction, I don't think we're arguing that all of this metalwork was made in these areas. It was probably brought in from elsewhere, whether some of it came from Ireland or from elsewhere in Wales. That these estuaries are probably prime sites for boats coming in, interactions taking place between people and different communities. Which brings you to kind of ideas that Sherratt was talking about in the early 90s, when he was sort of thinking about, why Wessex was so important in prehistory. And he uses sort of the river system of Great Britain to sort of map together all of the connections between different areas and people navigating through Britain by following different river courses. So here we can see this, people coming in via the Thames and sort of coming over from Europe, or people going out in that direction. And in this instance, the connection between Europe and Wessex. But I think you could sort of decenter this in some kind of way and start to think about more sort of like localized movement. And thinking about, just by turning the map upside down, you start to think about connections of people moving between headland and headland. And you see areas in different kind of ways, thinking about what's our study area. Is it a bit pointless talking about the Gower and this area in South Wales without really thinking about what's going on the other side in sort of Somerset and Devon? Thinking about connections between places rather than thinking in sort of geographical areas. So by thinking about coastlines in different ways, it actually expands our understanding. You see the Irish Sea as this kind of almost like little inner sea. It's not one sea. You have an exposed side of it, and then you have a more sort of sheltered side of it in the sort of the lee side of the Isle of Man. So different types of movements, different types of activities taking place in these. I think one little thing that opens us to this is this anchor stock, which is the lead anchor stock with these lucky knuckle bones carved or cast into the anchor. This is from the top of this anchor. This is found at Porthvellan, which is literally just off this map, a bit of a bad planning there. So you can see the map here. We've got Aberdaron there and Porthvellan around the other side. We've got Mynydd Mawr, which is here. So just off the map here. And this is a Mediterranean anchor from the 2nd century BC. So in the 2nd century BC, we had this kind of connection along the coastline of Wales, of North Wales, with the Mediterranean, which then opens us up to thinking about larger themes, of thinking of the inner middle sea of the Mediterranean, and this kind of thinking about Britain and Ireland, for that matter, not as a separate island entity, but as part of this kind of facade. It's very fashionable to talking about the Atlantic facade in the 50s and 60s. And I think we're sort of coming round to that again, thinking about connections between places along coastlines, and thinking of, maybe it's to do with language, why we think of British prehistory and Irish prehistory being very separate from what's going elsewhere. But maybe we should be sort of, with thinking about coastlines, we can think about the local, we can think about the specific, but maybe we need to think about this sort of more global perspective of coastlines. With climate change and sea levels happening, they don't just affect one particular area or one particular island, but they're sort of these kind of global themes which are affecting everybody. Okay, I better leave it there. Sorry if I've rambled, but there we go.